Good evening. We're thankful for you to join us this evening in our area of Oklahoma City. The 84th Street congregation is not able to meet tonight. We've had some heavy ice that's formed, more in the form of sleet, but it was forecast to be a problem here for this evening and probably for some time to come hereafter. So we're going to have this study by our streaming event, and we're thankful that you're here to join us. I ask you to look in your Bibles, if you will, and notice as we start this evening, we'll be looking at 1 Samuel chapter 27 through 1 Samuel chapter 29. We're also going to notice just a little bit of 1 Chronicles, only a few verses there, toward the very end of this study. But we've been looking at the workbook done by Granville Tyler on Joshua through 1 Samuel. We're on the next to last lesson this evening as we're just about to finish up this volume, just about to finish up the book of 1 Samuel. For those of you who are able to join us, next Wednesday evening we'll be having our regular singing the first Wednesday night of every odd-numbered month, and we'd be glad to have you join us there. We hope we'll be having it at the building of the 84th Street congregation, and you'd certainly be welcome if you joined us there. Starting a week from Sunday, our adult class will be in a new study. We'll be beginning 1st and 2nd Corinthians, so if you're able to be with us then, we would be glad to have you. But now what we're going to look at for a little while is our study on 1 Samuel chapter 27. When the kingdom was in the time of Saul, we noticed that that kingdom was one that was much less than what you have after the full extent of the kingdom and its territory as reached during the time of David. And so when you look at the kingdom as a whole, we have been for a good while looking at the northern part of that kingdom, and or rather the southern part of that kingdom, and this evening we're going to be looking at the northern part. That southern part of Israel down in the area of what was the Philistia area, or that of the Philistines. And we've been dealing a great deal with what was happening with David as he was fleeing from Saul. About midway down in the Dead Sea area, you notice that which is an area there we talked about last week where he had been hiding. When you look tonight, we're going to be shifting up much of our attention toward northern Israel. And as we go up there, we're going to be looking especially at Jezreel and the Jezreel Valley as it's pointed out here. We're going to have the Philistines starting to gather at Aphek, and they're going to go up toward that valley in order to battle those of the children of Israel. And Saul is going to be leaving from his area there in southern Palestine. He's going to go up and go to the witch at Endor and seek advice from her. And we're going to be looking at some of that as it's carried out this evening. When you look at the flight that David had that we've looked at before, David continually would be over into this area as he would flee from Saul, into the caves and everything that it would exist there. He took his family over to Moab to dwell there to escape Saul. And now we have him fleeing over from this area over into Gath. And he's going to go to Gath to the Philistines and be with them for a time during his life here. So that's what we're going to notice for a little while this evening. That time when David flees over into the area of the Philistines, goes down and raids the Amalekites and others as well. You remember we've looked at a great deal that David's place of his hometown was at Bethlehem. Over here on the map, just a little bit to the south of Jerusalem. Gibeah was Saul's hometown, just north of that here. And Ramah was the home of Samuel, and he had died at this time. Now, after his death, you have David flee to Gath and then go down to Ziklag. The reason is that he had asked the king for a place there, that rather than dwelling in the royal place, he would be better if he would go to his own area. And so what was given to him, according to 1 Samuel chapter 27 and in verse 6, is that Achish gave him Ziklag. And that's where David dwelt. Verse 7 points out to us, he was there a full year and 4 months. During that time, he was one who was involved in the raiding of the people that were pointed out, the Amalekites, who we remember that Saul failed to overcome because he did not obey God. Though Samuel had told him that God had declared they were to be utterly wiped out, no one saved, not man, not woman, not child, not even the beast, but all were to be eliminated. Saul failed to do that, and as a result lost the favor of God. David pursues them and others as well, and they're all enemies of people that were of Israel. And so he continues during this time to fight those who are the enemies, not the Philistines, but the others who were in the land. In chapter 27, verses 8 and 9, the text tells us David and his men went up and raided the Jeshurites and the Girzites and the Amalekites, for those nations were the inhabitants of the land from of old, as you go to Shur, even as far as to the land of Egypt. Whenever David attacked the land, he left neither man nor woman alive, but took away the sheep and oxen and donkeys, and the camels and the apparel, and returned and came to Achish. When he would come to Achish, he would be there and he would tell him exactly what he had done. Achish on occasion would ask what it was that was there, and he would give an account. The reason was because Achish had invited him to be one who would come in and live in his territory at a place where he was to be held or to be given freedom and safety. And so David accords him the honor of one who was the governing power at that particular time. And so that took place, and he found him to be one who was faithful. Achish found David to be that way. In chapter 28, it opens up with pointing out that David was seen to be one who was almost a right-hand man, a keeper of Achish, and trusted in that way. So now we have set up for us what the rest of chapter 28 is going to deal with. The point is made that you had the Philistines going up to the Jezreel Valley, and those who were of Israel were also going up along that way. They were joining together to do battle at that particular place. We're going to talk about that valley and its significance in Israelite history a little bit later, but that's what's going on. In this particular chapter, first, Achish brings his forces, the Philistines. He brings them to Aphek, and from Aphek, he's going to go and fight. But you see that Saul was also bringing his people up that way, but he was terrified. You see, the fact is that Samuel was now dead. He was one that Israel lamented. Saul recognized that now he could not go to Samuel and find out what God would have him to do. And so what Saul did is he inquired of Jehovah. He asked him whether he should go up against the Philistines. This is what you call one of those things of a lesson learned too late. He should have done that earlier. If he had done that in every case, of doing exactly what God wanted him to do and waiting to do things until God told him, he would not have been taken away as king. But now he had lost his place as the king because of that point. Well, since he cannot get a prophet and he cannot get others to come and tell him what to do, he turns to another thing, and someone tells him there's this woman at Endor, this witch at Endor, and she's able to tell you about the things of God. Well, all of us, I think, have probably heard of this witch at Endor. Does that mean that God really was seeing this woman as one who had the power to tell Saul what to do? No, that's not the point involved in that at all. The idea is when you look at this woman, she's going to be the most surprised person in the group when she brings up Samuel and he speaks to the group. During that time, Samuel was one who came, and he was one that had instructed Saul about what he would do. Saul recognized he was gone, and now he's going to hide himself from this witch at Endor, not tell her who he was. But he asked that she bring up Samuel, and she did. When you look at the text, it's obvious to me that this is not something that this woman was regularly able to do. As a matter of fact, the point is made very clearly. It says, when the woman saw Samuel, verse 12 of chapter 28, she cried with a loud voice, and the woman spake to Saul, saying, why have you deceived me? For you are Saul. And the king said unto her, do not be afraid, for what do you see? And the woman said unto Saul, I see a God coming up out of the earth. And he said to her, what form is he? And she said, an old man comes up, and he is covered with a robe. And Saul perceived that it was Samuel, and he bowed his face to the ground and did obeisance. You see, Saul recognizes who it is, and he is one who's ready to now show his obeisance or his humility in front of Samuel. He failed to do that before, but now he's ready to do so. Now, in all of this, what we need to recognize is God can bring about his will to be brought through anybody. And in this particular case, to the amazement of this witch of Endor, God chose to use this occasion in such a way as to bring a frightening unto Saul. Well, when Samuel had pointed out to him, what's going to happen to you is you and your sons will die on the same day tomorrow. When you go up in battle, this is what's going to happen. You're not going to be any longer seen as the king, but you're going to be taken from that place. That had been promised for a while now, but now it's obvious that that is what is going to take place. And so here is Saul, scared to death and not knowing what to do and not wanting to do anything, but he wouldn't even eat. He couldn't because of his fright. Finally, they convinced him to do that. And it's rather interesting, at the end of this particular chapter, there's a humorous point where it points out that this woman, the witch of Endor, was trying to get him to eat. She says, you need to eat so you can be on your way. Yeah, I imagine she did want him on his way. She didn't want him there anymore because the sight of Samuel and all that had happened at this particular time was obviously more than she could take. So finally Saul ate before his servants, and they rose up and went away that night, it says. And so they go on the journey from that point to go back unto the battle that's going to take place at the valley of Jezreel. In 1 Samuel 29, I want us to think about what's taking place here, as we've had in this map before. The point is, all are coming to be there at Jezreel. That is where this great battle is going to take place. Well, what happens when they go there? Let's look at that valley of Jezreel. You see on your map, the last one to come up, that Jezreel Valley labeled in light blue. All around that are some of the things that we'd be familiar with: Mount Tabor, Mount Moriah. Down over to the left of that, or to the west of where it says that Jezreel Valley, is Mount Carmel and so forth. But you notice just below that V in Jezreel Valley is Megiddo. The Jezreel Valley, or the Valley of Jezreel as it's also called, is sometimes referred to as the Valley of Megiddo as well. It was a central valley just a little bit to the south and to the west of the Sea of Galilee, or Gennesareth, as it was called in the Old Testament. And it was a place where there was a plain, and all roads led to that. If you were talking about the roads that were there that would come from the north or the south, the King's Highway, the mountain road area, it would all come through the Jezreel Valley. And armies would set aside on that plain because that's the only place there was to do battle on a plain like that, where chariots and horses would be of use. What happened is that David was ready to go against the children of Israel together with the army of Achish. But Achish's princes were not so sure about that. It says, "And Achish answered and said to David, I know that thou art in my sight as an angel of God. Notwithstanding, the princes of the Philistines have said, he shall not go up with us to battle." Well, why not? David was a valiant man. Why would these Philistines not want him to go with them? Well, they remembered what else he had done. He had been the one that had cut off the head of their giant, Goliath. He had defeated him in that way. In fact, the princes of the army had pointed out to Achish, "Isn't this the same guy that the song was sung about? That Saul has killed his thousands, but David his tens of thousands?" And so Achish goes to David and talks with him. David can't understand why it is that Achish is wanting him to go away and not be involved in this fight. As you notice in 1 Samuel chapter 29 and in verse 8, David said to Achish, "But what have I done? And what hast thou found in thy servant so long as I have been with thee unto this day, that I may not go fight against the enemies of my lord the king?" David was indeed being one who was subservient under the governing power where he was. But that put him in a place of also going against the armies of Israel. Now, if that had happened, what would the Israelites have thought about David? Maybe it could have been justified from the standpoint that those who were with Saul, by and large, had rebelled against God and failed to do the things that God would have them to do. And David might be able to think, well, I could go and be an avenging power for that. But the fact was, that would not have made for a smooth kingship with David when he was king over Israel. So here you have something where the people themselves are the ones who asked Achish to not use David, to send him back, to not let him fight together with them. And so that's what happens. And Achish goes to this battle by himself. It's him and the Philistines. Those who were with David, the 600, were not going to be involved in this battle. And in the end, that's obviously going to be for the better. Let me talk with you a minute about the significance of the Jezreel Valley. When you look at the significance of this particular place, like we said, it's where all roads come to. If you notice on the map over here, Megiddo, there's a little cut that goes just to the south of Megiddo into the valley of Jezreel. That's the coastal highway that would have cut through there and then would have gone out from that point on up to the side and up the north near the coastal area of northern Israel. That of the King's Highway, as it was in the middle of the area, would have come up through this particular point, would have been brought to that place. Then you would have had it come along over here and go up again from there as it went through the Jezreel Valley to the north. You can see it on the map on the right-hand side at the bottom. All of this area of the valley is where you would have had a coast or had a plains area, very used for agriculture today in Israel. And it would have been the only place with that much of a plains area where you would have a place for people to meet in their armies. If you notice, this one of the pictures down here, down on the lower left, looks at that Jezreel Valley there, notices what's taking place there as you look up toward Tabor. And then you have what's sometimes called Saul's Shoulder, the area from looking over to that, to the Jezreel Valley. Well, this Jezreel Valley is not a great distance there. Look to the lower right map and notice, if you will, the fact that there is a kind of a legend down here. That long of an area is just 4 miles. Well, what does that mean? That means what you've got in all of it is something that is less than 10 miles wide and something that's a little bit more than 10 miles in a length. But that's all it is. Now, when we think about this valley, let's remember something. This valley is also known as, it says, the Valley of Megiddo. In the book of Revelation, the term Har-Mageddon. Har is mountain, mountain of Megiddo. Megiddo was kind of on the side of a slope area, side of a mountain that was right here, and then it laid open to this. Many of our premillennial friends want to take this passage in the book of Revelation as being literal, that all the armies of all the nations will gather together in the valley of Megiddo. Well, if they do, there's no place to put them. With that small of an area, it's impossible for you to gather all of that there. But it was the size that you could have battle after battle taking place in Israelite history. As a matter of fact, it's one of the only places that you're going to be able to have momentous battles where you'll have people that are able to get out into that area, use their chariots, their horses, all of those things. And throughout Israelite history, there's going to be a great number of battles that take place in that particular point. Now, what happens when that takes place? Let me go back to that chart for just a minute. What happens is you have a place where there are momentous battles. In other words, you have the Assyrians or the Babylonians or the Medo-Persians or others coming through that area. Now, if they're going to go down to overtake Egypt, where will they meet in between in order to have a battle? Well, that's it. That's the one that'll be there. And if there are great battles in Israelite history that take place, then they take place there, especially if they're ones that are large enough to have a momentous kind of an occasion of a great change taking place. Several kings will die in that valley, the Jezreel Valley or the Valley of Megiddo. In fact, Saul is the first of those kings that dies there in the battle that is coming up. In chapter 30, we're going to look at that on Sunday, the Lord willing, dealing with the Amalekites' attack on Ziklag. They're coming down, and as David has gone away from the town, they're coming in now and attacking that. David's army is going to come back, and I'm not going to spoil that battle. That'll be one that we take up on Sunday with our class there. But I wanted you to understand where we're going to go from here. David had gone up to the north. He had been there ready to battle with them at Aphek. He had to come back down now, and he's going to be battling these Amalekites then at Ziklag a little later. Now, what happens during the time that David was at Ziklag? Let's get our bearings straight on time here. He's there 1 year and 4 months with the Philistines, it says. Saul is trying to kill him, so he flees to that area. Now Saul can't kill him. It could have been that he would have been used against the people of God in Israel, but the princes of the Philistines didn't want him to do battle, so he's saved from that problem, but not from warfare. From the time that David goes over there, he battles against the Amalekites and others, as we noted in chapter 27. And in chapter 12 of 1 Chronicles, it points out that as he stayed there, people kept coming to him. They were ones who were ready to help him in the raiding of these other countries. It says they helped David against the bands of raiders, for they were all mighty men of valor, and they were captains in the army. For at that time they came to David day by day to help him, until it was a great army like the army of God. You see, the idea that they were ones who kept on coming was something that showed that they were being built together as an army. That's the intent that God had. And God was helping this to take place. By the time that David begins his kingship, he's going to have had over 1 year of battle experience, and people are going to be seeing that. Some of them have come to him. He hasn't joined in the army together with the Philistines, but he's going to be one still known as a person who battled the Philistines in his early life and continued to battle them to this very time. What are the main points we can get out of tonight's study? Just in a way of overview, I wanted to suggest to you that David showed respect and honor to the king who governed, even the Philistine king. We talked about this last time. He had an honor for Saul. He was ready to kill the one who brings about Saul's death and stabs him, even though Saul had requested it, as we get a little bit further in this book. David had that respect because they were the ones that were given that place to govern. He didn't have the kind of haughtiness and the kind of a bit of his own full of himself, so to speak, to where he had great pride, to where he had to be the one to lead. David was ready to be used by God, used in his service, and he had a genuine honor and respect for those who were in authority. That's a good lesson for us to learn from him. Second, God could and did use, in Old Testament times especially, many unsavory characters to deliver his message. at times. Here it is with the witch of Endor. As I said, this is not obviously an occasion of something happening just like it normally did. When Samuel was brought forth, she was the most shocked of any person there and scared to death. But God used that time in such a way as to get a message across unto Saul, and that he did very well. When you see others that are there, sometimes characters like Balaam and others who are used as prophets, that doesn't mean that God approves of them. It just means that God used them at that time as he wanted to do. The Jezreel Valley, number 3, comes to be a place, as we said, of momentous battles and losses in Israelite history. As those take place, you start to look and notice a place gets a kind of a reputation. You know, we talk about that with various places that are there. When someone says he met his Waterloo, what do we mean? We mean a reference to history there as Napoleon met of a problem, a turnaround, a defeat that is taking place. It was something that turned a good thing into a bad thing from his point of view. So it is with the Jezreel Valley. It is a place that has great loss in Israelite history, about to lose the first king there in the case of Saul. Lastly, we recognize that God was working by his providence to bring the best for David and his coming kingship. It had to happen that David was trained as one in warfare. It was going to be his place to be the king that defeated the enemies round about and brought Israel to its ultimate place of its ultimate boundaries, and they dwelt in peace. Only then, the Old Testament teaches, could there be the time of the temple being built. That had to be in a time of peace, when then the ark would be moved to a permanent dwelling place. That all took place in David, but it took place in David as he was one who had gained much experience during this time. And God was working to bring that about. God willing, on Sunday, we'll be able to be meeting in the building on February the 27th. And our 9 o'clock hour will be a time of preaching and worship together of God in our assembly. And then we'll be having a Bible study and worship there in the various classes at 10 o'clock. And then at 11 o'clock, we'll be having another assembly and a time in which the Lord's Supper is served at that time. Now, in that 10 o'clock period, we'll be studying lesson number 26. J.T. Carlson will be looking at that with us, and that will complete our studies in 1 Samuel. I've enjoyed the study, and I've enjoyed being able to be together and meet with brethren here on this place as well. Last time we had a streaming time. We had several from the Philippines, and I was so happy to hear from them. I've been unable to go there, though hopefully I'll be able to do that fairly soon now as travel opens back up and is a possibility. Real quickly, before I go, let me suggest a few things to those of you, especially who are members at 84th Street, but some others who might be wanting to know about this as well. Our effort is to try to expand some studies on the internet, both by these streaming kind of classes that we may have on particular subjects. I'm going to be trying to do more of those in the not too distant future. And also to do some of the sound-only blog type things that are used. I've forgotten the term that you use for that. But we're going to be dealing with some of those in kind of smaller 10 or 15 minute bite sizes. And the first thing we'll be doing is going through the book of Matthew. As many know, I'm in the midst of, or really right toward the end, of finishing a commentary on the book of Matthew. It's been many years in the work. And so what I'd like to do is put that out there to be available in bite-sized bits of streaming on or putting it online for it to be used where people might be able to listen at a particular passage that they're interested in knowing something about. So you may be looking for those things. We hope to get that going fairly soon. That's it for tonight. Thank you for joining us. Hope you'll stay warm. Take care and God bless. Good night.